Hello Internet, I'm Jesse, your comrade JokeJB. I hope you love media analyses as much as I do because we're going to be getting much too deep into Dalamjiwa Gosumdochi, Squirrel and Hedgehog. The Daily Dot called it Breaking Bad as a cartoon, an animated TV series about heavily armed woodland creatures operating as spies in defense of their homeland that you might have heard of before as being tantamount to the ultraviolet Mickey Mouse of North Korea. Stories are a fantastic lens into a country's culture, and lenses are sorely lacking for the outside world looking into North Korea. And this isn't a lens I'm about to take half measures looking through, so grab yourself a drink because this is going to be a proper deep dive into Squirrel and Hedgehog. Now, my Korean is not wonderful. I'm a linguist. I do my absolute best to pronounce things properly in my videos. You might have noticed, for instance, that I have an absolute blast fitting Nahuatl words into my segments on cultural relativism. However, for the sake of clarity, and because there's a hell of a lot of characters in this series who already have rather similar sounding names, I will first introduce the names of the characters and places and such in the series with their Korean names, and from then on refer to them using their names translated to English. And let's get this out of the way right now too. I am not a supporter of the North Korean government or its ideology. I'm really fascinated by it. It's like, what if you took a car crash that just kept happening forever and made people live in it? But human rights are important to me, and while it would be juvenile to assume that North Korea doesn't have legitimate reason to be driven to some of the ridiculous diplomatic relations it's become known for, or that the plight of the North Korean people has nothing at all to do with the American-led sanctions leveled upon their country, its guiding principles, called juche, are an inherently failed ideology. If you ever meet a communist that stands North Korea, you've got my full permission to laugh in their face, because juche is explicitly neither communist nor Marxist, and references to these foreign ideologies no longer exist within the North Korean constitution. I won't get too much into it, but just for context, juche is an all-encompassing national ideology that has its roots in socialism, in wanting to free people from exploitation, especially by capitalists and foreign powers, by hyper-focusing on militarism and almost isolationist self-reliance. Korea has a long history going back centuries of fighting back Japanese conquerors, and North Korea was formed explicitly from Kim Il-sung's rebellion against what was, in my opinion, one of the most brutal occupations of any country by any other in world history. I won't talk about that further because I'd need to absolutely plaster this video in content warnings. But that's the context that Squirrel and Hedgehog exists in. You've got Gokdong-sang, Flower Hill, a beautiful place full of free and happy little animal people that is our obvious allegory for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And you've got the Weasels, the primary antagonists of the series, Rude, who are hell-bent on the conquest of Flower Hill and who are very obviously intended to represent the Japanese. Nationalism is huge in Squirrel and Hedgehog. The plot, although it isn't episodic and progresses over time, does some rinse and repeat. There's a scheme. It's found out by our spies, Gyomsagi or Golden, and Juldarami or Striped Squirrel, and the scheme is foiled. But always the scheme is more and more dangerous, closer to closer with Flower Hill, with deadlier and deadlier weapons of mass destruction. And while the antagonists fight among themselves, rarely holding allegiances for long, fighting for power out of pure emotion, the protagonists fight for nothing but the freedom of their home. Along with selfishness, emotionality, fear, the greatest sin of all depicted is innocence. When the series begins, a great amount of destruction happens, leaving Flower Hill as the final bastion against the Weasels purely because of the innocence of these doomed defenders outside of Flower Hill, the belief in the benevolence of the invaders, and in the steadfastness and reliability of this bear who is definitely not the Soviet Union. USSR Bear, his name is literally just Bear, is very protective of the denizens of Flower Hill, but he's an alcoholic and his wine is drugged, leaving him incapacitated when the weasels attack, and Golden, our protagonist, was right all along to be armed and prepared for an attack. This first episode is Juche, in a nutshell, and is echoed in the first episode of the second season with Golden's brother, Bamsagi, meaning brown, very creative, proves to be too trusting of strangers, believing that the war is over, there's no need to stay on guard, and this results in kickstarting the conflict anew. Now, before I go on, I should note that the show's producers, SEK Studio, usually deny any real-world allegories were ever intended. Sometimes they'll contradict themselves, but despite how glaringly obvious these metaphors are, the studio maintains that they just want to contribute to the intellectual and ideological education of the people. Let me just say that I genuinely like this show. If you just handed it to me and didn't tell me where it came from, I'd say that it's a weird, maybe somewhat repetitive, but genuinely well-made cartoon. With some exceptions. Is that fucking Monstro from Pinocchio? It's got lovely visuals and well-done animation, which puts popular shows from the US at the time to shame. Some surprising plots with interesting gray morals and gorgeous music. It's also absolutely brutal. And if you think American cartoons turn too much of a blind eye towards violence, whoa, it's got nothing on the brutality of Squirrel and Hedgehog. The brutality is what tends to be the first, even the only thing that Western reviewers pick out about the show. And I actually find that a little sad, because all 2 of the reviews that exist on YouTube and the Daily Dot review, they all focus on the same things, formulaically. 1. Squirrel and Hedgehog is anti-American propaganda. And I have to wonder if these people actually watched the show. The American analogs don't show up until the last 2 episodes. The last 2 out of 32. So I wonder what that says about these American reviewers that out of 32 episodes, they choose to act as if the final 2, the ones with America, represent the entire series. 2. Squirrel and Hedgehog is violent. And, I mean, yeah, it is. But it isn't devoid of emotion. I find it interesting that the show seems determined to only very rarely have more than 2 protagonists on at a time. And one of them is always Golden, who's very stoic, a proper soldier, and seems to be the sort of blank slate for the audience to slip into. The duotagonist from most of the series, Striped Squirrel, is a lot more emotional, and at times even ways that his friends may be more important to him than all of Flower Hill. Although not as prevalent, there's more to these characters than just fighting the enemy. Now, I don't want to make this a response video. I already said I'd never do that, but I just want to say that if you've seen other reviews, don't expect more of the same from this one. Connor the Waffle reviewed the final episode claiming that this guy is a mad scientist, and Golden here was completely ignoring the impending deaths of his friends in order to fantasize about killing his enemies. People on his channel have even pointed out that this is a really obvious mistranslation, that Golden's actually lamenting the plight of his friends at the hands of this mouse here who is definitely not a mad scientist. His name is Momangcho, and I'll be talking about him a lot, so stick around. But moving on for now, while the violence is usually the first thing people notice about the show, another thing that I think is of particular note is the massive amount of affection shown in Squirrel and Hedgehog. This is really interesting culturally because SEK Studio was asked whether the show's depictions of these very close, affectionate touches, even cuddles, and the intense longing depicted between 2 male friends for each other are pushing a homosexual agenda, to the point that when a studio in Italy acquired footage of Squirrel and Hedgehog for republication, they omitted a lot of these cuddly scenes or bluntly changed the gender of characters. And while the North Korean government doesn't have an official stance on homosexuality and there are no laws explicitly against it in North Korea, it's clear that the culture of North Korea is not very gay-friendly. Like in South Korea at the time, to be gay was synonymous with being degenerate and opposing general ideas of morality and the prevailing ideology. So when approached about this, SEK said, "No, these characters aren't gay, they're just very close friends. In North Korea, very close friends are comfortable hugging, embracing, cuddling, dancing together," which almost certainly isn't the case. While it's hard to say for certain, given the aforementioned limited lens we have into North Korean culture, it's safe to say that South Korean culture was, and still is, very guarded around physical contact. Even today in South Korea, at least by my understanding, you don't really even hug in public as a man. Even if your friend is bawling their eyes out, you don't touch them. It just isn't appropriate. And culture, especially culture around such fundamental things as physical contact, doesn't change so rapidly. I don't think it's realistic to suggest that between 1945 and 1977 that the democratic but definitely not gay People's Republic of Korea changed sharply from Neo-Confucian emotional distance to hegemonic cuddliness. So why did SEK Studio make these characters so damn lovey? Seriously, look at this! There's more of it! There's so much of it! It makes Disney look like it's run by Vladimir Putin. Is it just because they wanted to paint Flower Hill come North Korea as a beautiful place full of boundless comradely love? Could be. Is it that they actually are hoping for a North Korea that's more openly romantic, maybe more gay-friendly? That might seem fringe, it probably is fringe, but given how closely integrated views of sexuality and gender roles tend to be, it might be worth looking more closely at that too to decide. And Flower Hill is incredibly genderless. We have both male and female characters working as spies, as soldiers, and the same can be said of North Korea too, which has mandatory military service not only for all men within its borders, but all women as well. And in Squirrel and Hedgehog, at least in Flower Hill, male and female characters are actually quite visually indistinguishable, and there doesn't appear to be any difference at all in how they treat one another based on their gender, hence why it was so easy for Mondo Studio to just gender swap them. And you might initially think that this is because SEK is just bad at making their characters look and act distinct, which is kind of true, but not when it comes to gender. Time to have our first real look at the bad guys. The Weasels embody many things that are antithetical to the ideals of Flower Hill, and we'll get around to talking about them all, but let's first have a look at their women. There are no female weasels in the show, but there are mice who are subservient to the weasels, as are definitely not South Koreans. Do you want to see one? Are you ready? Okay, bam! Yeah, that's a mouse girl. Can you tell? Damn right you can. Minnie Mouse has a bow and eyelashes. This mouse has boobs. Here's another one. And another. There's a lot of them. Okay, time for something different. In the final 2 episodes, a new man antagonistic group is introduced in the Wolves, who are, they're definitely not the United States of America. It's actually interesting that, just like Flower Hill, there's a lot of diversity in species among the wolves, maybe acknowledging the greater ethnic diversity in the United States along with the gender diversity, because they do have a woman, a foxy one. This is a woman. This is a woman. And this is also a woman. So what are we getting out of this? We have the good guys, the North Koreans, who have women who are just as strong, just as smart, just as talented as their masculine counterparts, to the point that Mondo Studio insisted that Mulori, Wild Duck, yes, her name is Wild Duck, Wild Duck is a boy in Italy because I guess they took even more issue with a woman being a twice martyred badass. Yes, she blows herself up to save Flower Hill twice. Than they took with this. Because, yeah, as much as Flower Hill has badass chicks, it also has badass boys that are just as cute, just as sensitive, and starry-eyed. There is no gender in Flower Hill. In Flower Hill, genderlessness is a virtue. And this is highlighted by the very stark gender differences in the culture of their enemy, which has no female leaders at all. Only very sexualized, very weak female subordinates that essentially exist only for the comfort of their superiors. Even when we do have one female character with power, representing perhaps the more gender-inclusive culture of the United States, we see that gender inclusivity as still very inherently divisive. Officer Yo, which, you guessed it, Officer Fox, is still sexualized, still subordinate to her superiors. The bad guys who, in sharp contrast with the bad guys of Western cartoons, are never gay-coded, like, at all. They're depicted as being, if anything, overly distant. The good guys are full of love. Straight-seeming, gay-seeming, doesn't matter, gender doesn't make a difference. SEK Studio says, love is love. It's not saying anything about sexuality itself, it's a kids' show, but it is saying that, to even the most hardcore, badass good guy, love is important, and that's something the bad guy lacks. With one exception. Enter Wulmangcho. His name means forget-me-not, as in the flower. Yeah, you can already probably tell he's quite possibly the most interesting character in the series, and my personal favorite. He's absolutely fascinating. The word Wulmangcho comes from Chinese, which, when broken down, does literally just mean don't forget. The Latin name for the forget-me-not, Myosotis, comes from a Greek word meaning mouse ear, and his brother is named Equibali, one ear. So don't imagine for a second that SEK didn't put an absolute ton of thought into this character. Probably more than any other, given the weasels are all just called variations of weasel, or purely by military title. Forget-me-not is who he is. He's a mouse, so he's reckoned by everyone to be inherently subservient. He's smacked around by the weasels, he's tortured by our protagonists. At one point he has his tail ripped off, but don't you forget him because he keeps coming back. And it's primarily Forget-Me-Not and the events around him that convince me that, despite the very obvious metaphors that I've been poking fun at, Squirrel and Hedgehog is not only a propaganda series. There's a lot more nuance to it. In case you missed it, yeah, I did just say our protagonists engage in torture. In fact, there's one scene in which Golden, again our main protagonist, threatens to kill a mouse to squeeze information out of him, gets that information, and then kills him anyway. Get show! Golden is also the one who rips off Forget-Me-Not's tail. And we could read this as North Korean cartoon encourages its citizens to believe in the righteousness of the torture, abuse, and murder of its enemies. Yeah, I could see that reading. Everything is righteous if it's done in the name of protecting our home. But there's something very sympathetic about Forget-Me-Not. He's unique as an antagonist because he isn't fighting for the dominance of his race, or for personal power or glory, or even just out of the weird sadism and anger the wolves and weasels have against Flower Hill. Everything he does, he says, he does it out of passion, out of revenge, and out of determination to live. His repeated declaration, directed at Golden, is, "I cannot die while you are still alive." This is in sharp contrast to Golden's motivations, who frequently talks about his willingness to give his life for Flower Hill, and doesn't seem to have any specific animosity or really any attachment at all to his enemies. We root for Golden as the protagonist, but look at how Forget-Me-Not is depicted in his lowest moments too. He's the only antagonist we see to show emotion apart from anger, and he does cry, embracing his brother. And this isn't played for laughs, this isn't a minor thing. I would argue that Forget-Me-Not is the main antagonist of the series, the most obvious foil to Golden. None of the antagonists are stupid, except maybe One Ear, and it's a really nice break from the bumbling, single-tiered plots of the pure evil Disney antagonist that the weasels and wolves of the world try, and frequently succeed in tricking the protagonists and getting a leg up on them. But no one does this more frequently than Forget-Me-Not. This bespectacled mouse is the one to discover Golden's identity as a spy, and despite his unceremonious introduction, he's by far the most persistent antagonist in the series. It's fascinating to me then that truly the main antagonist of the series isn't a foreigner, so to speak. He's a mouse. That is to say, he's a Korean. he's not of a high position, he never becomes of a high position. To me, he doesn't represent the threat of a foreign enemy, or really even the threat of a traitor. He's not from Flower Hill, never held any allegiance to it, any more than he holds allegiance to anyone else. That's what he represents. The threat of individualism. The threat that lurks within the heart of every Korean. He's sympathetic because he says to the audience, I am you. In that moment, when you are driven by your own emotions and hatred, when you forget your allegiances, when you decide that your own individuality is more important than your country, you are forget-me-not. The ultimate message that Squirrel and Hedgehog is trying to send is, forget yourself. Forget me. Remember love for your home and your countrymen. And there are other morals, other cultural values that we can take out of it too, to reflect on North Korea for us. The interplay between interdependence with your comrades and self-reliance, definitely. The value of self-sacrifice, absolutely, all over the place, straight on through to explicit martyrdom. Equality between people, between sexes, maybe not as explicit, but it's definitely there. Perhaps even equality between, if not sexuality, then at least different expressions of love. As long as the love for your homeland comes first, then love for the people in it can only ever be worthwhile. Bravery, honesty, and obedience, in contrast to the cowardice, treachery, and constant complaining of the antagonist. Diversity, perhaps ironically given the emphasis North Korean culture places upon heritage, with the different species of Flower Hill contributing to the cause in their unique ways, squirrels as intelligence, hedgehogs as armored soldiers, ducks as the Air Force, in contrast to the slavery-based ethno-state the weasels run. The value of intelligence, honing your mind as well as your body. I don't think I've ever seen a kids show place so much emphasis on the plotting and problem-solving aspects of being a spy. And we know that about North Korea. Becoming a scientist is one of the only ways to avoid otherwise mandatory military service, and there are a number of prominent scientists in Squirrel and Hedgehog. So with all these morals, generally good ones in my opinion, if you forget the ultranationalism, what do you think it says about North Korean society, given how popular it's been there for generations? Think about that for a moment. Now think about what it says about the North Korean government that in 2012, after only 2 episodes featuring the Not American Wolves had aired, the series was abruptly cancelled, and reruns ceased airing less than a year later. This was the same year that Kim Jong-un effectively came into power. Did he take rapid offense to the portrayal of the United States as antagonists in an internationally accessible TV show that's become the furry face of the DPRK? Or did he decide that the more fluffy, progressive, egalitarian morals of the show were no longer good to feed to the North Korean populace? Or was it something else? Maybe it was just a coincidence. But, despite its popularity, Squirrel and Hedgehog now seems to be gone forever. And though I've spent, as I said in the beginning, far too much time analyzing the heck out of this crazy TV series, I can't really tell you what to think, because I'm still not sure what I think myself. I'd love to hear your ideas though. Let me know in the comments, give me your thoughts on the show, and my analysis. How did I do? Be sure to also like the video so YouTube doesn't cancel me too. 감사합니다. 안녕.